Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first sessions of Technological History of Fiction. What if fiction was never opposed to science, but rather its secret double? We will trace a radical genealogy of how different literary techniques were infiltrated by scientific experiments and media practices, from the 19th century first distant approximation between narratives and empirical science to the latest research and crossroad of media, technology, and the humanities. We will explore how fiction borrow not just metaphor, but instruments, and how storytelling becomes a technology of knowing. This course is by Pavel Arsenev. Pavel Arsenev is an artist and theorist. His joint artistic and research interests includes the history of pathological and linguistic ideas, media ecology, and material culture of the avant-garde, the technical history of literature and empirical science, and contemporary political poetry and post-socialist independent publishing and counter archives. He is not part of the artistic research group Agents Étrangers in Marseille. Pavel's main interest in art lies in graphic aspect and the materialization of poetic text. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to see all of you at my course, Technological History of Fiction. And thank you for your interest and your discipline to come on time. I see that there were a little bit more persons inscribed in the course, but maybe they will join us later. And in any case, we record our sessions, right? So in the beginning, I will say a few words about the nature of my interest and the trajectory which led me to this course. Then I will tell a little bit about the transitory points, publications, ideas, or other courses which I taught, so that you will understand in which context will exist our actual dialogue. And starting from the maybe in 40 minutes, let's say, I will pass to, in 30 minutes rather, I will pass to survey around the course. We'll observe what will happen on these four sections, 4 classes. And what is the theoretical intrigue? We will discuss why this questioning exists. So why interest to facts and to technological facts could be deployed in literary science, in literary criticism, if you prefer. We'll also discuss institutional positioning, which could happen, which could be appropriate for this questioning. And we, by the end of first hour, we already definitely will be in the first topic, which is today formulated as media archaeology of communication and the epistemology of fiction. So in general, our lecture, or like, let's say, monological part of the seminar, my lecture will be during next 2 hours, and a little bit less, hopefully. Depends on how fast material will be unfolding. And at least last 20% of the lecture every time, maybe even more on the next seminars, will be devoted to actually dialogue in different forms with you. So today it's rather like open discussion, and therefore we'll just discuss what was not clear during the lecture, and you may ask any questions about the course in general or about today class. But on next classes, we will obviously have more your participation, I hope, because as it is and we'll also discuss what you need to do for passing this class. We will make a presentations, and you will make a presentations. I will listen to them, and we may discuss and distribute the topics later through the environment in Google Class or wherever you prefer. But in general, there would be something like 10 texts which should receive any form of presentation. Presentation means that you will unite into groups of 2 or 3 persons. It depends on how many finally will have participants here, and read this or this text and present it in any form, whether it will be just traditional, like retelling, let's say, of the text, its main ideas, or you will present maybe the presentation of video, or I mean, let's say screen presentation for mapping the ideas of certain text. I will give you a visual example today by my own presentation, and we'll try to discuss techniques in literature, not isolating from contemporary forms, meaning digital forms of organizing material, hopefully. And after that, so these texts, which I just mentioned, they are already listed in the course page. So it's like today, for example, I hope it was even mentioned that we will discuss 2 texts, Honoré de Balzac and Friedrich Kittler. And for the next session, one of these texts, very unequal in scale, I mean, in amount of letters, will be also the option for this kind of presentation if someone will decide to immerse in this first topic more actively. In the end of the course, so evaluation will depend on presence and active participation in our discussions. Second, on these presentations, which each of you will hopefully make in some group of 2 or 3. Or we may think about dividing text into 2 if you prefer work like individually. And the third option, or third factor, let's say, of evaluation will be, of course, some final essay, which I also hope most of you will be able to write. But essay, and here I should precise that verb write, maybe not completely precise. This essay could be again like in different media forms, and I will be happy to see not only texts on the screen or in PDFs, but different forms of creative attitude to material, meaning like video essays, or again some digital forms, pop-up websites, whatever. I may discuss it in details. It's mentioned in syllabus. Yeah, so why technological history of fiction? And yes, if you want to ask any questions, either technical or administrative one, if you prefer, either concerning the material which I will present today, either about like planning of our course, you may raise your electronic hand and intervene if you want. Okay, let's start, Matvey, from beginning.
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question about the presentations. So just to not make influx of presenters for one specific text, will there be some form of a Google Sheet or something to put my name on a day or something, or maybe I'm running ahead, I don't know.
So text you already know that I mentioned on the page on the website. We will create this Google Doc when we'll understand after today class, we will understand how many persons, and on this will depend how we will divide this text, because there are sometimes texts of 400 pages, right? We will necessarily divide them in for 2-3 of you, maybe even more. Sometimes it's short preface, but very much as in Balzac's case, but it's very much a specific text of 19th century, which again requires some competence, let's say, and maybe inclinations towards old text and so on. And in this sense, we may discuss it also in the end, who will be eager to take these or these texts, and we may create even like together with you during the class, but better we will economize time of the class, and together with our kind moderator, we'll create this Google Doc. Okay. Cool. So then, if there are no more urgent questions, I will start the presentation so that you would have some more varied visual material than my face. Okay, where is it? It's here. So I'm sharing the screen. Can you see something?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Now I couldn't see. Once again. Because I see. Because it became the full screen. Just a second. Okay, should work. Sorry for certain feedback loop. You will see your own Zoom call, but hopefully it will work better. Okay, so why technological history of fiction, and who I am to speak about fiction, its history, and even some particular version of its history, which I would prefer to call technological or material and technological. So I'm a literary scholar and was always attracted by history of science and techniques. So there is some contradiction, as you may imagine, between these two things, because history of literature and history of science and techniques, there are 2 or even 3 different histories, and some of them better connected as science and technique, some of them as literature, sometimes even opposed to them. So I had these contradictory interests. I received a doctoral degree in Geneva University in 2021 and published a monograph, which you see on the screen, based on this defended thesis. So the thesis was in Russian and French, but the monography for the moment published in Russian. Its title, I translate, and you see on the screen, Literature of Facts and the Project of Literary Positivism in Soviet Union of the 1920s. So why facts? Apart from different disciplines already collided, I also introduced the notion of fact and literature of facts. What is that? So I define my main interest as, you see it's again on the screen, literary positivism. So the moments when literature, starting from 19th century, the latest, expressed some very articulated interest for facts in different sense, and here we may see the variety of positivism. But one of these peak of interest maybe happened in Soviet 20s and was linked to this movement a novel called Literature of Fact or Factography, and its main protagonist was Sergei Tretьяков, to whom devoted this book. So a few words about this version of interest of literature to facts and how it's linked to technique. So first of all, you understand that it's a sort of a latest and maybe even peak of interest of literature to facts, which already integrated topic of technique and topic of literary technique. We'll discuss it in details consciously, which means that during 19th century interest to technique and to facts, like scientific facts, for example, or journalistic facts, existed abundantly, but rather unconsciously, and sometimes things were not clearly called. And technique, for example, for a long time was a metaphor. And we will talk more about this passage on the third class, when technique in literature stopped to be metaphor and became a metonymy. But together with by the moment of futurism and Russian formalism, technique already started to be integrated very consciously in literature. So you see, for example, the picture, the cover of the book in Russian, Язык Ленина, means language of Lenin, or Lenin's speech. The book, paradoxically enough, is authored by Alexei Kruchonek, one of the most radical futurist poets. And the picture, the cover of this book is was made by Klutzis, which is again very interesting figure, which we couldn't discuss now at length. And here you see that some technical objects, some very strange technical objects and technical facts are integrated in purely linguistic, if not literary, environment, and book privileges even this only technical object. So this was a big movement to long story, long history of this movement. We will discuss again on separate seminar, the last one in the end of August. But I will shortly show you what I have already published about that. If you will be interested, you may again refer to this publication. One of these publications will be in the bibliography for the last class. So you see radio of the future and futurist poets as its first engineers, right? As an example of approach in literature to technique. You see the article Sergei Tretьяков between literary positivism and the pragmatic turn. You see the name of Walter Benjamin and his reception of the East. This famous figure was mediating Tretьяkov's practice, operative practice in Germany, mainly in German-speaking world. And you see the title, A State of Emergency Literature, Varlam Shalamov versus All Progressive Humanity. So all these articles were more or less based on this research and monography. So I'll show you also a few, sorry, this is in Russian, it's content, but I will show you a few covers of chapters, so that you again understand from where my interest comes. So Tretьяков was a very prolific author and was at the same time poet. And therefore, we're talking about lyrics and semiotics. He was also the theater writer and was working with Merholt and Eisenstein, and was inventing so-called psychotechnique, one of the inventors, psychotechnique. Then he was also writing prose, traveling prose, or applying some dispositive of photography to prose, and started to make photography earlier than Rodchenko. Then he was also an activist and went to kolkhoz to make his operative practice to establish its theory, but also apply. And finally, there are some consequences, let's say, in German-speaking world and in French-speaking world, which are linked to contemporary for him avant-garde technique. So I researched this in last chapters. So you see mainly surrealists and those who were close to Bauhaus. And then one of the branches, maybe the most tragic branches and consequence of this factographic way of writing was deployed in camps, in Soviet camps, by Varlam Shalamov. So this was more or less my initial interest to this very exciting moment when literature integrated technique in general. But now I'm working on the second monograph, and it's titled The Physiology of Language and the Discursive Infrastructure of the Avant-Garde. And to this material, we mainly will refer on second and third science. So what is physiology of language and what is discursive infrastructure of the avant-garde? So first of all, you see the term discursive infrastructure, and this term we will immediately discuss today in relation to Friedrich Kittler. But Friedrich Kittler was writing mostly about German literature, and he only proposed to apply it to different national literatures. And I'm trying to do this with, again, Russian and Soviet, mainly Soviet avant-garde. So let's imagine that avant-garde was not completely aware of technique, but what had at least some discursive infrastructure and was involved in certain experiments with technique or literary technique. The expression literary technique appears exactly on the very end of 19th century, beginning of 20th, and we'll discuss who and how used it and what it meant for all of them. But in general, you see the setting where development of science, evolution of science, and certain scientific discoveries in physiology, psychophysiology, influenced modernist poetry, modernist painting, and art in general. So this moment in philosophy, quite often called second positivism, in philosophy of science, first of all, and this is already interesting, which means that there is second and previous one, and maybe also late, some post, neo, and so on. So I link this moment in science and history of technique, which already clearly presented in science, and next to science, let's say, I'm linking it to the modernist moment of literature and mainly analyzing on the material of futurist poetry and formalism as a first scientific theory of literature. Okay, here I'm still working. It's like work in progress, but there are also already a few publications which you may also spot in the bottom of the screen. And some of them, again, will be discussed more in details on one of our classes, because it's again linked to the moment of meeting of certain literators, as for example, Lev Tolstoy, and certain technical objects, as for example, phonograph, which happened in certain year, in certain environment. At the same time, we will discuss the theoretical repercussions of such meetings between literators and technical objects, and which consequence for the theory of literature this approach has had. And all the same, I will show you shortly the type of connections, let's say, between literature and technical objects here. So this is exactly the moment when Tolstoy was sitting in front of phonograph. the previous one, the previous chapter cover touches the moment when dialects were started to be researched scientifically, and at the same time it was presented in Collège de France, where a few symbolist poets noticed and were influenced by that. We also discuss how Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, linguist, was linked to contemporary literature and science at the same like. And we'll talk also about different technical objects as typewriter, who are, for example, also influence the way we are thinking, as Nietzsche was saying. Okay, so this is the second period, which is linked to so-called physiology of language and discursive infrastructure of the avant-garde. But at the same time, and this is more and more closer and closer to our today topic, we may go even deeper in history and talk about literary positivism in 19th century. And this is also their ongoing publication. It didn't happen. It's not just prepared, it's ongoing. So literary positivism in 19th century, organized not as monography, but as a series, let's say. So there are seasons and episodes. And first season, for example, touches the earliest moment of literary positivism, which is linked to the names of Belinsky, Comte, Balzac, who we'll talk today, and so on. So if you read in Russian, you may again refer to these titles and see from where all this story starts, let's say. But in two words, which are preceding our talk today, there were several persons, mainly white cisgender men, unfortunately, who were presenting different sorts of connections between literary epistemology and scientific tendencies to be literary. So you see, it was more interpenetrating than later. And in this moment, you may say science and literature, they only started to diverge. They only started to organize their divorce. And how it happened, why it happened, we will talk today. So, so you see the names. We'll talk about Zola, Émile Zola, Auguste Comte, a little bit about Russian reception of this earliest Belinsky's reception of positivism, and so on. So which topic here could be? Again, it's mainly meeting with certain technique of telling, like physiological ocherk or essay, but also first meeting of literators with technical objects, though they maybe didn't understand completely what is happening. On this photo, you see Gogol on the photograph. So it's the first photograph of literator who was writing in Slavic language and who was writing exactly in these years about portrait as a genre, like one of his short stories, let's say, novels rather, was entitled Portrait, and without understanding that in this very moment he was existing in the moment of invention of daguerreotypie or like early photography, you wouldn't understand about what this portrait about. Yeah, so let's start to move to our today topic by opening the next chapter of discussion. I guess we are moving well according to the schedule. Does anyone have any questions by now? All good? I'm not sure that I see your hands. Okay, Then we're moving further. Okay. So, as you may deduce from this short self-presentation, I'm very interested in different episodes of approaching between literature and science, as I told, which takes either a form of certain literary positivism, right? When literature aspiring to convey facts in 19th or 20th century, or pays an additional attention to physiology of speech and to technical instruments of writing, as in second period, which I was presenting. So I decided to establish the transitory zone and called it, as our course, material technical history of literature. And this is completely new domain, not approved, if you want, not recognized properly yet, which I invite you to explore together and to develop together. So the central theoretical intrigue of such an endeavor is implied in the very foundation of the literary studies and in the history of their scientification. So let's see, what does it mean, material technical history of literature? So, of course, central intrigue will be linked to the moment of foundation of literary studies. And according to my linguistic background and my training in different countries, this should necessarily touch the topic of formalism. What is formalism? This is a group, like unofficial group of several literary scholars in early Soviet years. Some of them maybe you even know, like Viktor Shklovsky, Yuri Tynyanov, Boris Eichenbaum, Jakobson, of course, and this group it's not stable, so it's defined very time anew when the story of formalism is attempted to be told, and it's very much about point from which the story is told, because at least there are several stories in formalism, depending on whether you tell more literary or more linguistic version, whether it's more from St. Petersburg or from Moscow, and so on. But there was some basic foundation, and which is still very much defining what is literary studies. So academic literary studies, starting from formalism, has sought to describe the mechanics of formation of literary facts. And now here you see some strange doppelganger, right? It's not literature of facts, but some literary facts. Tynyanov had coined this notion, and we will discuss in detail why it's so much resembling to scientific term, not just scientific term, but actually is scientific term. So academic literary studies try to explain literature through literary facts and to explain them, rather than relying on some impressionistic empathy. Because before formalism, of course, some literary criticism existed. And you see this stigma even in English language. Sometimes we talk about literary criticism and not literary studies, right? Sometimes we talk about literary history and not literary theory. What does it mean? That before formalism, of course, literature was somehow analyzed, was somehow commented on, and most often it was different forms of fallacy, or at least something that was later described as fallacy. Whether it was more about historiosophical fallacy, whether it was psychological fallacy, or it was just impressionistic criticism. You know, the best critic of this criticism, of course, Jakobson, I will quote him, what was before formalist. different mixture of encyclopedic material, different mixture of psychological observations, and so on. And this Russian-speaking and mainly Jewish gentlemen, decided to establish literary studies as scientific. And for that, they organized some, let's say, foundational repression against so-called parallel series. So you see, this is the second term, which is very important for formalism. And from one side, they were inspired by positivism description. For this reason, you have literary facts, right? Which sounds very scientific. From other side, they also used the term of literary evolution, right? Laws, you see the second point, second thesis, the laws of literary evolution, which of course were drawing on Darwinian evolutionism and on the very idea of evolution. So there is no revolution, for example, in literature, as you may expect for revolutionary state, but evolution, which of course, scientific term. Yeah, so they were inspired by science. They borrowed certain scientific terms, but at the same time, they put a prohibition on future external inspirations, future source of scientific borrowing, and called all these parallel series. When, for example, literature is explained or being analyzed through some parallels. We will break this spell, this prohibition, and we'll try to analyze parallel development of science and arts, mainly visual arts, in second lecture and seminar. So instead of this parallel series, formalists propose to concentrate on immanent explanation. What does it mean, immanent? It means that we are not referring to historical context, we are not referring to psychological states of author or potential psychological states of reader. We're not trying to write a second book, which will be literary on its own. We are analyzing literary facts. And what is literary facts for formalists? It's language itself, how it is organized, in later versions, how it's perceived, and so on. But at least they started from letters, really from the most simple, most basic experience of literature. What is literature for you? Someone will say, this is impressions, or this is a parallels with my own life, or this is about history, or this is something else. No, for them it was letters and only letters. And you see the two very legendary publications called Poetica, which contains the most famous text from Shklovsky, for example, which we'll read on the third session. Shklovsky, Victor, Art as Technique. Sometimes it is translated as Art as Device. And it was translated many times and has different titles and nearly on like the main European languages. I will provide you the materials again in our group, chat, or somehow. So if you will zoom, you will see maybe that this famous text in Russian, Искусство как прием, Art as Device, is published in second chapter of Poetica. You may also see the year, which is very interesting, 1919. You may imagine that on the second year of the revolution, October Revolution, it was quite strange to concentrate on the questions of poetic language, but nevertheless, it is a case. So it is a fundamental attempt to make literature scientific, and at the same time, as I already told, it's paradoxically isolating literature from different domains, from so-called parallel series, and making it scientific at the same time. Yes, the main enemies of literature, of literary immanence, of course, not science, like more mundane things. Psychology and history and so on. But at the same time, history and psychology also became science during similar decades. And at the same time, now we don't understand why you should distance from these domains to be scientific if they became science as well. So anyway, I afford something like term war formalism, or let's say the period when literary studies had to fight for its autonomy, by the analogy with war communism, of course, or military communism. When these texts and these publications happened. And this war on military formalism, of course, was obliged to exclude everything what they find like non-scientific and autonomize, let's say, literature on the cost of this parallel series. So we will try to challenge these limitations of the era of war formalism, and we'll trace the genealogical connections between various literary technique experiments and their contemporary scientific experiments and media technique. In each case study, beginning with the first distant convergences today between literature and the empirical science, we shall analyze not only the literary and scientific texts themselves, but also the various methods by which they are linked, because sometimes the type of connection differs, right? Because ranging from like classical media archaeology of knowledge right through the very latest publications on interdisciplinary history of literature, science, and technology, you will see sometimes opposition, sometimes it's rather like friendly cohabitation, right? Or neighboring. Sometimes it will be secret borrowing of inspiration from science to literature. Sometimes it will be unconscious application of certain technique in different sense of the word to literature and so on. But I think that viewing the history of these two domains, meaning science of literature, is important as a parallel histories or adjacent histories or technologically shaped, because sometimes it's more important not what scientists were saying and literators on the other side, but which instruments, which tools they were using. And if the tools were same or similar, as in the case of invention of Marais, Jules-Étienne Marais, who invented the way to record the movement of anything, starting from heart and ending with tongue, then maybe the epistemical qualities also could be could be paralleled. So of course you could know also the term histoire croisée, like crossed history. Of course, you may see your own references, and I will be happy if you will put these questions and ask like whether it makes sense in this domain or not. I will try to answer. But in first approaching, we'll discuss what is material technical history of literature, or as I call it in one publication, what it could be technoformalism. So I'm not proposing to get rid of formalism. This is a fundament with its own limitations, but nevertheless, I would propose to rather radicalize formalism and make it technically sensitive. So I told about these genealogical connections. I told about distant convergences and how we will study texts. So on the left, for you, it's still the left, I hope. You see 4 sessions with titles. We'll approach to each one by one. And in the end, I will say what is the goal of the course and what you will, in the end of the presentation of the whole course, I mean, before coming to the first topic. I will say what is the goal, what will be the results maybe of this course. So I told that we will try to think about this history as a joint history. And we'll try also to rethink certain dichotomies which exist in literary studies and which normally divides 19th century realism and 20th century modernism. Conventionally, they're distributed between the autumn and spring semesters. We have even more strange timeline. We have this course in summer, and maybe it's strategic advantage. So we may put under the question the normal division of semesters and topics in the universities. So what is modernist and realist rivalry? Normally, it's a rivalry between, as you see on the screen in the first point, between passion for representation, as I may generally define it, and fascination with the surface. Between literature as a window onto social world and world in general, and the construction of one's own instrument dedicated to language. And this first quotation maybe makes sense to be linked to the author, was Stéphane Mallarmé, who once pronounced in his manifest crise de vers, crisis of poem. He meant mainly musical instrument because he's talking about music. But for us, it would be more important instrumentality itself and not music. And he proposes exactly to create, to construct even to every poet his own instrument and dedicated to the language. So you see this conscience of technicality of language grows again in the same years when the word literary technique appeared. So what else? We'll also examine how this immanent logic of literature combined with an attention to parallel series, as we already called it, and why it's not necessarily contradicting. Because the role which was played by science in the 19th century and closer to the 20th century technology is crucial. And seeing these parallels and drawing these parallels could be important to understand in literature and not to abandoning it, right? Which is already what I'm saying now. I mean, which is already a sort of a post-formalist criticism or some add-on, let's say, update of formalism, but not completely erasing their inventions, because I will show how formalists themselves were unconsciously sensitive to technique, not only to science. So then we'll see how realism as a commitment to photomechanical objectivity, actually, again, rather than conscious approach to technique, how much it ought adapt to science and technology. Whether literature became experimental, the next question will be, by case, just occasionally, whether some concrete scientific developments and scientific experiments or even certain laboratory led to this enterprise, and whether after that literature and art became experimental. There is certain date before which I never met application of this adjective experimental to literature and art. And then obviously everything became super experimental and it started to be sort of obligation for arts. So we'll discuss this foundational text and its connection to the physiological laboratory and program. for modernist literature. And then finally, we'll try to historicize objectivity, which is maybe the most ambitious goal of this course, because the very formulation, historization, or history of objectivity even, is a contradiction, right? Maybe you will be already ready to involve now in the discussion and say why it's contradictory, history of objectivity or historization. No, not ready yet? Okay, you may relax for a while, but I will nevertheless point to the important things to think in the future. Okay, so let's see how all these phenomena exist. Let's see real examples, and let's see which text could be key text for us. So today and first lecture will be first topic will be about media archaeology of communication and literary epistemology. This is these are the faces which you maybe already know or recognize even from my presentation, and we will start with one German guy who once gave this quotation to us. Strictly speaking, says Friedrich Nietzsche, there is no such thing as presuppositionless science. The thought of such a thing is unthinkable, paralogical. A philosophy, a faith must always be there first, so that science can acquire from it a direction, a meaning, a limit, a method, a right to exist, wrote he in Genealogy of Morale. So what Nietzsche claims here? That particular science has emerged from the spirit, right? From certain presupposition that it's impossible to be completely neutral and completely scientific, if you want, in the sense that science has no these presuppositions and like a empty page. What it means for us? For us, it means rather that there is always some literary genre which precedes maybe science, some literary ambitions of the author which maybe precede, and nevertheless, claiming that there is a spirit of a literary genre would be a sort of a literary centrism. What is literary centrism? By opposing it, we mean that literature always preceded or literary ambition or literary encyclopedianism preceded any kind of writing enterprise. And since philosophy, as in case of Nietzsche, or science, it's also always about writing, it means that there is some phantom of literature. So our intention is rather the opposite, not to claim the rights of literary centrism, but rather to explore the paradigm of science and technology of literature, of literary positivism, as I called it earlier. So to see what could be the epistemology of genre, and maybe even technological unconscious of certain genres and certain literary epochs, as, for example, physiological essay, as it was called, or natural school, as it was called exactly in the 19th century, in the beginning even in the 19th century. And yet, whatever the direction of influences may be, early realist prose and positive science, including sociology, are united by a number of common familiar features. The stage of gathering material prior to writing, its classification, whilst maintaining the emphasis on the empirical nature of the data, and finally, the organization of the facts into strictly descriptive narrative. Descriptive means rather than gripping, right? Rather than exciting. So all these was called physiological for the first time, though it was still very much metaphorical usage of the word. Physiological in context of this essay means natural. And that is radically opposed to romantic, for example, and the idealistic. So the science of the natural school, it's a movement exists in Russian prose in first third of 19th century, could be regarded as, for example, the first example of science, scientific transfer from France and from Auguste Comte positive science. So French positivism also influenced directly to French realism, but what was new in this is rather the opposition to previous type of relationship between science and literature. So the tradition of 19th century was based on rather friendly atmosphere between these two domains. And the best example, figure to show how it existed is Buffon. So Buffon was naturalist, and he is often cited as an example in relation to this process, who was still drew equally on stylistic resources of his writing and on the detailed description. So you understand what is naturalism, right? Natural history and naturalist. So this is a certain ancient type of pre-scientific, if you want, type of science, which actually consists on not only ability to logically connect the ideas, but also draw, for example. So if you are not drawing properly, you couldn't be naturalist, right? Because you should give illustrations, and until you will refer to someone else as a drawer, as an author of these sketches, you will already lose the competition. So for that, in 18th century, actually, and a little bit in the beginning of 90s, it was still very important to draw properly and to write also properly. And so Buffon was the one who, according to the Flaubert Dictionary of Received Ideas, was one who put on lace cuffs before writing. What does it mean? It means that he was writing not only too well, but also too often, right? So when he was elected to the Académie Française, he devoted his inaugural address to the concept of style, which is again very strange for scientists, right? If you're a scientist, you're talking about perspective of science, inner problem of science, but not about style. So not only did this not cause anyone any discomfort in 18th century, but it even filled Baudelaire with admiration. Baudelaire, I recall, it's already very, very deep 19th century, so it's much more late. So, however, Buffon miscalculated, and the subsequent history of science choose him as a negative example, using him as a point of departure, rather, in science own effort to do away with literary stylization and to develop a transparent language of scientific description, or the language of facts. And so here you see one first epistemic or linguoepistemic claim, which literary positivism, as I call it, will repetitively will introduce. So transparent language of facts. What does it mean? And maybe you know who was the first who insisted on in transparent language. Sorry, I don't see your hands, so just start talk if you while the presentation is unfolding. No? Okay, then we'll come back to this later. So so transparent language of facts, was this obsession of literary positivism and not only of science itself. And this is only one of the forms of the linguoepistemological rift between science and literature that received this particular emphasis. This trend was only reinforced by the fact that Buffon was frequently recognized by literary figures, and in particular, a century after the publication of Natural History, we have this person and this text. La Comédie Humaine, the great text of Honoré de Balzac, which normally started to be dated from 1842, mentions, alongside a German poet who was equally a naturalist, meaning Goethe, we'll come back to him, this Balzac preface, it's a preface, not the novel itself, claims, I quote in English, though it was in French, of course, in the beginning. I saw that in this respect, society resembled nature. Doesn't society make man according to the environments in which his action takes place? As many different men, as there are varieties in zoology. So you see there how one of the first transfers of ambition and of scientific rhetorics comes to literature. Social species, continues Balzac, have always existed and will always exist, just as there are zoological species. If Buffon, and we see that he mentions his compatriot, already dead but very famous still. If Buffon produced a magnificent work by attempting to represent the whole of zoology in one book, wasn't there a similar work to be done for society? Asks Honoré de Balzac. And during next decades, he's deploying this task for society. So he's starting to describe society as if it would be a variety of zoological species. And from this exactly, the term of physiology comes. So physiology of Paris Boulevard, physiology of cafe, physiology of this or this social class, physiology of gloves, for example. So in the end, there was a physiology of everything. So this word started to be so popular in literature because Balzac consciously decided to apply zoological method rather of term of species as well to social work. So here you see already like 3 points, right? It's not just science/technique on the one hand and literature on the other hand. There is also society appears entering the scene. So society here is a Pandora box which makes literature scientific, not social, not politicized. This is true, of course, but in this quotation you see that so society is a pretext of making literature scientific. So in other words, this was preface to Human Comedy. but in one of the, in Père Goriot and Father Goriot, he's asking this sacramental language, he's posing sacramental language. Sorry, it's not in French, it's in French, but he's asking something like, oh, no, you should know, this is not a fiction nor a novel. All is true. All is true was in English in the original. So you see, while pretending to be scientific or quasi-scientific, as it was already happening with zoology, Balzac at the same time annulating literary pretensions, literary ambitions of his own enterprise, which is, of course, not completely sincere, and which is, of course, a literary device. But you see, he was even to change the language, saying like all is true. So in the same way, literature tries to change the language. It's just not national languages between which immigrates, but like scientific language, from literary language to scientific language. And this is a expansionist reflex of literature for all the history of literary positivism, which we will discuss. Okay. So in other words, Balzac not only acknowledged the merits in this quotation, the merits of Buffon style, as well as Goethe's scientific discoveries, we'll come to them later. But also Balzac makes a point of noting the borrowing of this method from zoology and its application to the study of society. Not to confuse with study of literature, as in case for formalists, we'll discuss it later. So perhaps here, Balzac is making one of the first instances of the transfer of scientific epistemology into literature. Balzac's study of social types and his account of the history of morals not only claims to be the heir to natural history, to Buffon in person, right? But also rivals the similar ambitions of the social sciences, which are just emerging, which don't exist yet as a faculty, as a domain of science. And indeed, the author of the Human Comedy, whom today we know as a literator, as a novelist, as a great author, described himself in the epoch as a docteur en sciences sociales. So you see the irony. First, we're talking about literator who is claiming to be scientist, or at least social scientist, right? Second, he's using the term sciences sociales, which never existed yet, which didn't exist yet. Now they exist, of course. And in this sense, you may say that social sciences were established by Balzac, or at least he was the first who used this expression. But anyway, he wants to be docteur en sciences sociales or do social botanizing, as it was called later by Henry James. Again, one more literator very interested in science. And certainly not as an author of narrative fiction. So you see, in literature appears some certain literature starts to detest itself, right? To try to be not itself. And for that, you need to claim that everything further down is not a fiction and not a novel, but true. True means science, right? Or at least the object to which science is applying its efforts. So at the same time, and in the very same city, there was another monsieur called Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte, a figure which is no less significant in the history of literary positivism. And he also was engaged in collecting social facts and describing them accurately, therefore scientifically. Unlike Balzac, Comte regarded questions of style as secondary. and unlike Buffon, and believed that the modes of expression in science followed naturally from the subjects under discussion, as with the naturalists, for example. For example, those who, like Cuvier, this is a biologist who came after Buffon and explained that Buffon was wrong. And he was first to point out the excessive and unescapable rhetorical style of his predecessor, meaning Buffon. And in a way, he made a founding sacrifice, let's say, of a colleague and a teacher nearly to the transparent language of facts, of science. So you see, this is something like ritual, right? You need to have this ritual sacrifice. Sacrifice someone from your predecessors, and to say that predecessors were not perfectly scientific, and therefore we will be, first of all, scientific, and then all the pre-scientific tendencies of predecessors will be erased from the screen, from the list, from the page. So what I want to say, it's never completely fair, because science as well as literature never exists by jumps, right? There is sort of at least science is collective enterprise, and here we see how certain attempts of purification of science, of sanctification of science itself, is happening in slightly staged way. Nevertheless, even this, one of the earliest attempts to do away with rhetoric by Cuvier and by Auguste Comte, turns into an obsessive, in case of Comte at least, turns into an obsessive list of rules and recommendations designed to help writers avoid the temptation to resort to flowery phrases. I give you the second quotation on the screen. You may read, and I will quote it in voice. No sentence was to exceed 2 lines of his manuscript, equivalent to 5 of print, meaning if you want to be a proper scientist. No paragraph was to consist of more than 7 sentences. He further applied, probably I already broke the rules. He further applied to his prose writing the rule of French versification, which forbids a hiatus, the concourse of 2 vowels, not allowing it to himself even at the break between 2 sentences or 2 paragraphs. Nor did he, meaning Auguste Comte still, permit himself ever to use the same word twice, either in the same sentence or into consecutive sentence, though belonging to different paragraph, with the exception the monosyllabic auxiliaries. So here you find this obsessive interest to grammar, to rhetoric, which could only a French writer could have. Though this writer was not literator, but a philosopher of science, one of the most famous, probably, philosopher of science of 19th century. Peculiar thing that this positive polity, a system of positive polity, is not. So the quotation which I gave you, it's not from Comte text, but from Mill's retelling of his system of positivism, and at the same time his translator, first of his translators. So okay, we will end this chapter with French repercussions between science and literature by the peculiar fact that the term positivism was actually invented by Comte, and even if he was very ignorant or maybe even hostile to literature and stylistic inventions in his recommendations of how to write transparently, He nevertheless became very attentive to literature after certain biographical events and to poetry, and started to be even a philosopher of certain positivist aesthetic. So here is one more example how these domains in first half of 19th century were existing very intertwined manner. Okay, after discussion of this literary epistemology and what it could be as a term, we are coming to media archaeology of communication, in the second part of our first lecture, and I hope we are still on good terms with this time. Yes. So after, sorry, it's a bit too fast. Yeah, Comte, and now we come into media archaeology of communication. So first of all, certain German authors were already mentioned. Yeah, and when you pronounce epistemology, and especially of genre, of course, you should make it with a French accent, right? But if you talk about media archaeology, then you're obliged to refer to German authors. And we will do exactly this move, and we'll start to quote from German authors, especially because some of them were already mentioned, right? So one of them was mentioned in Balzac preface to Comédie Humaine, and it was Goethe, right? I mentioned it briefly, and we will see what does it mean, why he was mentioned. So Goethe was also some transitory figure and hybrid figure, and if Buffon was first of all, or should to be first of all, naturalist who was writing too well and stylistically too inventively, then Goethe was, on the contrary, first of all, poet, but also a scientist. And Goethe was interested mainly in physics of color and light. And he had, for example, very excessive rivalry, desynchronized rivalry with Newton, who established foundations for physics of light and color. And I would say that this discussion is rather interesting to be discussed. So we may take, for example, if you would like, one of the texts devoted to this rivalry between Goethe and Newton, and we'll discuss what was the point and how much we may believe to German poet, what was that point, and how much we may believe to German poet in his scientific claims. Okay. But before that, we'll put the other question. So why in general sciences and literature in beginning of the 19th century and up to the middle 19th century was so important? So according to Friedrich Kittler, our next author, like relatively contemporary author, who is in our bibliography, according to him, archaeology should be accompanied by media archaeology. So he's drawing on three French authors, moving in the same, let's say, direction as we, from French to Germans. He was himself German, I mean, Kittler, and he's drawing on three post-structuralist authors, meaning Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault. So Foucault, in his famous book Les mots et les choses, the words and things, I will translate, though it has proper English translation, which is The Order of Things, Archaeology of the Human Science. It's slightly it's not slightly, it's completely different books. The one whose cover is present and the other which I'm quoting from. So the Foucault's investigation stops exactly in the moment where Kittler starts. And Kittler starting his media archaeology, not only of knowledge, but of communication, from the beginning of 19th century, from such a foundational figure as Goethe. So according to him, the emergence of German Romanticism didn't begin with a change in themes or plots. These remain the same, but with a new approach to text. And you see that we are discussing not like content of the text, but some approach to the text. What does it mean? In place of diligent scholastic translation, rote learning, and the man of letters submitting to the primary sources, there emerged a subject in this German Romanticism, a subject capable of freely interpreting them. What does it mean, freely interpreting? It means that you stop to just comment and rewrite, which was also very important embodied procedure for scholastics, but you start to invent. The most modest form of invention is translation. And even in translation, you need to make some decisions, so you start to interpret text. You may misread it, you may misunderstand it, but first of all, you are involved, right, on the level of decisions, even for misreading and misinterpretation. So the tradition of book culture, which was developed by humanism and the Reformation, preceded Romanticism, were becoming obsolete with this new gesture of invention. And however, even those who like the protagonist of Goethe's play Faust, have grown weary of participating in this endless self-sufficient reproduction of signifiers, as Kittler puts it. So I give you the first quotation from this foundational text, Faust, which will show us what is the change of attitude to the text. Maybe some will read and I will make a short breathing pause. I'll be very thankful to you. I will share the screen again and would someone will be so kind to read this nice passage?
Yeah, I don't mind. Oh.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So in the beginning was the word. I read, but here I flick. Who helps me to proceed? The word so high I cannot, dare not rate it. I must, then otherwise translate it. If by the Spirit I am rightly taught. It reads, in the beginning was the thought, but study well this first line's lesson, nor let thy pen to error over hasten. It is the thought, does all from time's first hour. In the beginning, read then, was the power. Yet even while I write it down, my finger is checked. A voice forbids me there to linger. The Spirit helps. At once I dare to read and write, in the beginning was the deed.
Thank you so much. So what happens in this passage? Faust translating Evangel, right? So from the first line, I hope you recognize the source of translation. But at the same time, he hesitates how to translate. And the word is put into italics by Goethe, because here hesitation starts for his emblematic figure, for his emblematic personage. So first, they translate this as word, but it's not. Maybe it's rather thought, the second idea, right? Then thought also seems not to be precise, and then this very same word from Evangel is translated as power, and in the end as deed. And from all these variations, as you may imagine, the meaning changes, and not slightly, but like crucially changes, right? So with word, we have more lingua-oriented universe. With thought, the more intentional and maybe philosophical one. With power, we have already a completely different political talk. And finally, with deed. What manifests deed here? So all these paraphrases do not vary tropes and figures of speech, but break through to the most authentic denotation. So it's not a question of like semitones, right? It's the main and central signifier which is being variated here. So in this variation, Faust, or more precisely his pen, is driven by something that Goethe calls the spirit, which compels a shift from just sifting through various signifiers to a single central signifier, right? So which philosophical hints we may see here? So successively translating this word logos, obviously, as scholastic census, as Leibniz craft, and finally the transcendental act, which is own romantic convention, meaning deed. Faust no longer scores for parallel passages to comment on, but embarks on a semantic quest for the transcendental signified, as Hitler put it. So we start to suspect that with Romanticism and Faust, we start to suspect that word is not just a question of semitones, it's actually what Derrida later will call central signifier, which means that on this material element, because word is always material, right? Either it's pronounced or printed. On this material object on the page or in the air, in the waves of sound, our universe, our thought universe will depart. And maybe even more important, not which word will be finally chosen, but the fact that there should be some central one. The fact that there should be something which was in the beginning, according to Goethe and Evangel, that something should be this, takes this central position. So what I want to say that Faust no longer places his faith in the letter, but in the spirit. He relies more on his feelings than on the rules of language, consulting his own intuition and needs rather than ancient texts. So in short, he is engaged in a form of free translation, so-called procedure invented by Romanticism, not only in semantic sense, but also in institutional and even pragmatic one. After all, no one demanded Faust, no one commissioned him to carry out such textual operation of variation signifier. So by interpreting this very central signified logos, this word logos as an act in the very last line here, Faust, first and foremost, performs an unprecedented act of self-establishment through writing. Because if translator decides that words should vary so much, he is definitely introducing his figure in this text or in this translation. Prior to this, poetry was mainly focused on the written word, but never on the act of writing as such, right? Because act always bring in the word, but words not necessarily bring in act. The writing itself an act. of speaking. The order, I'm quoting, the order of representation excluded the representation of the very act of production itself. This one of the Hitler teachers, meaning Lacan, was claiming in his famous text. So in other words, philosophers had previously merely commented on the text of the Bible. The real task, however, lies in altering it. Could say Faust and Goethe after him if they would like to mock one later German philosopher. And this is precisely what Faust does, whilst at the same time establishing the model of authorship. Why it is important? Because the Romantic epoch was foundational not only for German literature but also for German sciences, and therefore overall for institutional organization of knowledge. And I will give you one more quotation from Nietzsche again, and his text on the future of our educational institutions. I'm sorry, it contains one untranslated passage, which we will omit. But again, maybe someone will be so kind to read this passage so that I will breathe a little bit. Thank you.
How is the student connected with the university? We answer, by the ear as a hearer. The student very often writes down something while he hears, and it is only at these rare moments that he hangs to the umbilical cord of his alma mater. He himself may choose what he is to listen to. He is not bound to believe what is said. He may close his ears if he does not care to hear. The teacher, however, speaks to these listening students, one speaking mouth with many ears and half as many writing hands. There you have, to all appearances, the external academical apparatus, the university engine of culture set in motion. This double independence is enthusiastically designated as academical freedom. The one may speak what he likes and the other may hear what he likes.
Thank you so much. So you have now some meta description of what should happen also during our course, and I hope we will slightly diverge from this erroneous description. But I propose this quotation not for self-reflection now, well, for that too, but first of all for explaining why this romantic introduction of free translation, free variation was important. Why involvement of the subject was historical in text production was historical event, because it at the same time changed the relation between the scholars or authors, who were at the same time teachers. So following in the footsteps of Nietzsche, who was called the last philosopher and the first media theorist, Hitler examines the external apparatus of romantic written culture and sees in the practice of this free translation an expression of the academic freedoms guaranteed by the Prussian state. So this description looks like a little bit like body horror, right? There are hands which are writing, ears which are listening or semi-listening, and mouths which are talking, and it's like very much dehumanized, right? But at the same time, it's rather correct description of what is happening in the universities. And Hitler, and I after him, quote this place from Nietzsche because this guarantees these academic freedoms where everyone is free to listen or not to listen, to write down or not write down. They were introduced again in the same epoch of Romanticism from which our history of literary positivism starts. It was introduced with some peculiar document, which we'll discuss now. And just as a student may choose what he wishes to hear and has no reason to believe what he hears, professor also may, according to this document, may say more or less whatever he wishes. So too does actually Faust, relying not on the letter, but on the spirit, right? What comes to his head. The prerequisite for this act of free poetic translations and these academic freedoms are the same. And also the protagonists were quite often the same, because professors were very often also poets, and poets were professors, as it was exactly the case of Goethe and many others heroes of our story. So what was happening? Sorry, it's a bit too early. What was happening in particular with Faust? He signed some act, right? He put his signature on some contract with Mephistopheles, signed contract with him, and signature is an act of involvement, of introducing of the subject and actually of body of the subject, which determine the subject behavior and requires no interpretation, in contrast to poetry. So signature is very univocal. In other words, it is the opposite of the free translation. So the condition of possibility of free translation and academic freedom is a signature. Either it's signature on the contract with Mephistopheles, either it's signature of the poet on the contract with the university. And exactly in the same years, precisely in 1794, the certain document was issued by Prussian state, which then influenced like Goethe's institutional biography, but also Hegel's, and up to Nietzsche. So because the author of Faust, I mean Goethe, was not only a widely renowned poet, but also a private counselor of the Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach land in Germany, and he was obliged to place this title before his name in all the documents, actually. So German Romanticism leads a dual poetic and bureaucratic existence, if you want. As one later poet will say, two souls dwell with my breath, the bureaucrat and the poet. So let's talk more precisely about this document, so-called land law, Allgemeine Landrecht, and what it changed in relation between poets and bureaucrats on the one hand, and like the audience and the state on the other. So first of all, this document enshrined copyright, and second, it separated educational institutions from the church. So you see the cover in slightly different pages. Why it was important for German intellectuals to separate educational institutions from the church? Because church in the epoch was already very much reformed, of course, but still they were dependent, if not on Latin text, at least on some rhetorical procedures which were still the same starting from scholastic era, and which are exactly overthrown here by Faust. So scholastic procedures were pretending to command modestly, to rewrite the text, but not introduce authorship into ancient text, right? For example, through the procedure of translation. And for this reason, this is why it's so much connected establishing the copyright and separation of educational institutions from church. So schools and universities became state institutions and state slaves, so-called bureaucrats, who were at the same time poets, lately very famous poets, started to use this free translation procedure abundantly, and at the same time teach in separation from the church. So material taught was no longer limited to biblical text in Latin, I mean. So this alliance emerged between the educated class and the state after rupture with the church, right? The intellectuals who were far and far institutionally from being monks, they should found the new harbor, and they signed, metaphorically speaking, this contract with the Mephistophel, meaning German state. So exalted romantic authorship, which so often opposed to bureaucracy, to the state, to different institutional, to let's say stable institutional framework, is actually just an effect of this institution, is actually defined by the national state necessity of liberation from the yoke of Latin. And in this sense, German linguistic nationalism and the founding myth are specifically associated with Romanticism. Is also appears in very new light. So here I plan to show you for the end the chapter. So you already seen the first text, which is in our syllabus today, Comédie humaine of Honoré de Balzac, and we are I mean, I recommend you to read all of it, but it's a huge text, and we will be precisely interested in preface to it, where Balzac says about what is important from science, and the other book, which will be interested next seminar. Well, I tried to introduce it already today, but I mean, for next seminar, we will be listening your presentations, hopefully, about this. This is Discourse Networks, 1800 by Friedrich Kittler. So I recommend this translation. So you may make a print screen or photo, and at least read the preface also. So if you have no discipline to read many hundreds of pages, then please read preface, which are explaining why it's important, why it's groundbreaking. So this is more or less what I wanted to tell today for our introduction. And this is why I was talking approximately about 2 hours. This is why I'm stopping here now, and will be very happy to discuss with you what was not clear, what was wobbly, what was not properly pronounced, so that we will have the same picture and the same understanding from where we start and to where we go. So would be very happy to have some questions or just observations. Yes, please, Niam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pavel. I'm just wondering if you could say something about the role of formalism, you know, which you kind of introduced earlier on, and that sort of disappeared. And in the context I'm wondering about is where it's really kind of fascinating, as you describe, how the act of representation, you know, and the really the kind of concept or the invention of the author, you know, where you bring in Nietzsche to talk about, on the one hand, I think you've already been talking about the idea of the fragmentation of the object of study through science, you know, and the distinction of disciplines, and then how in literature it's establishing its own objects, and then also on top of that, the act of representation that really can't be represented. It somehow becomes a sort of a transcendental kind of ideal or form. But with this fragmentation of the kind of embodied, author as observer, also a scientific kind of observer, who's in some ways bound to try to ground their observation, and what it is their object of empirical study is. But that then there's I'm just wondering about the whole kind of thread, or the thematic you were talking about in terms of formalism, and this tension between the fragmentation, of the author, and because when you speak about formalism, I wonder actually how you're kind of defining that. I'm thinking of it very much in the sense of form, content, and it's sort of determined by, let's say, a kind of a concept, and and that also it pertains really to scientifically maybe an idea of of unity, and parts that belong to a whole. So I'm just wondering about this tension between the fragmentation and the kind of contract with the institution that comes in here, as part of this grounding, and how much formalism is playing a role in that. Hope that makes sense.
Thank you for the question. So first of all, I should precise that there are many formalisms exist, right? So we're not talking about all of them, or at least not at once. My take was only about Russian formalists, so-called Russian formalists. I'm not insisting in this term, but we don't know how to define it differently. And this has nothing to do with like mathematical formalism, for example. It has nothing to do with poetic formalism, like the movement which exists in the 20th century in America, right? When like people are coming back to more stable poetic forms, right? It has nothing to do with different forms of scientific formalism and so on. This is only so-called Russian formalism in literary studies, and it has very exact periodization from, let's say, the first text was written and published in 1913. Exactly this, Shklovsky, one of the first authors, and it was very much related to like Russian avant-garde, which will become Soviet in 4 years, but still Russian before the First War will start. Just in a year, just imagine the situation. Some young students actually at the epoch are meeting in different cafés Chantin, and reading their papers and reading their poems. All of them are friends. And this is very like legendary moment, let's say, in literary studies, at least for Slavic branch. But this very meeting of poets and scholars, or very young students of philological department, then influenced the whole study of literature in 20th century. So this one cafe, let's say, in St. Petersburg, called Бродячая собака, Wandering Dog, is a foundational moment and momentum for the whole formalism, and therefore for structuralism, and therefore for post-structuralism. All of them referring to this moment of first Shklovsky paper, which was called, and we will read it. So we will talk more about formalism. So I don't want now to usurpate. I like formalism very much, and I don't want to like start the second or third lecture now. So be attentive to the schedule and for this third lecture, which is called Psychophysiology, Aesthetics, and the Origins of Formalism. And here we will talk at length. But at least for the beginning, I may respond that this was an exposure of theoretical intrigue. So I tried to explain why the course pretending to be like inventive, so to say, in theoretical sense, and with what we will not necessarily quarrel, not necessarily get rid of, but with which tradition we will be in dialogue. So we will be in dialogue with tradition of Russian formalists in literary studies, and we may play with parallels, with different parallels, with different formalisms, right? But it's rather connotational for us, while formalism it's one of the most stable meanings. Formalism from Russian and then Soviet 10s and 20s is the matrix which we will try to keep in hand and which we will try to see the limits of. Because my claim was that formalism, it's a great invention that we should first of all concentrate on text in material sense of the word, as I tried to do it with Goethe and previously with other authors, right, in the lecture. But at the same time, we shouldn't be blind. We shouldn't be blinded by text, and we should see the parallels, as in today's lecture, with epistemical situation, with parallel series as science, technology, and so on. And therefore, formalism, it will be a sort of a pharmacon for us in this course. So it will be basic knowledge, which we'll try to explore if someone is not familiar enough, but at the same time, which will try not to monumentalize and not to, not to make a needle idle from formalism, but we'll try to transcend. Let's say we'll try to radicalize formalism and explore possibility of existence of something like techno-formalism, as I proposed. I hope I answered.
Okay. Yeah.
Arnab was the next.
Thank you for the brilliant session, Pavel. I had two questions, and the first is about formalism itself, and not specifically Russian formalism, but how the formalist movement was present across many nations, across many national cultures, and I was thinking of formalism as a mode of looking at the text, the immanence of the text, but how far does, if you could explicate on this a bit, does the emphasis on formalism and form lead to, like as you mentioned, structuralism and post-structuralism? And has there been any study that maps this genealogy, the history of formalism in the avant-garde that actually contributes to structuralism and post-structuralism? Has there been any study regarding this?
Of course, yeah. Again, you may collect your questions, and if I claim that we will talk about that and then we wouldn't, then you may blame me for being forgetful. But I think that we will talk not only about formalism, but about branching towards structuralism and post-structuralism. Well, they're branching to each other later, but we wouldn't have lecture precisely on structuralism. So in two words,
right.
In terms of history of science of literature itself, these steps are very much recorded, like in chess game. We know precisely how it passed, right? It's enough to pronounce two names like Roman Jakobson and Levi-Strauss for like referring you already to huge bibliography. So if you're interested, there are more popular versions of these passages. They are more scientific. You may also, maybe it will be more convenient if you will ask me, let's call this type of question bibliographical. Like you want to know more about this in the comments, in the chat, and I will collect these questions, and for the next session, we'll provide you with bibliography of different sorts and levels. But of course,
Pavel,
this is very studied. I would say it's overstudied. How Jakobson running from revolutionary Russia, staying first in Prague, then in different countries. Being Jew, he's running from in 30s from Germany, of course, and at some point arriving to America, where he actually was meeting Levi-Strauss, also running from Nazi, and appearing there together. They are inventing, if you want, they're writing certain articles in co-authorship and devoting, analyzing text from Baudelaire, which I mentioned today. And in this meeting of French anthropologists, ethnologists, whoever, and Russian formalists, linguists, and even poet a little bit, this meeting will be foundational for the structuralism. And you may say that structuralism is a sort of a son, or there's certainly some affiliation between them. And we may discuss also on third seminar what exactly structuralists took from Russian formalism and where it's bypassed or didn't understand or was more inventive. Or you see, I'm trying you to invite to the similar adventure, saying that formalism is not enough, though it's super exciting on its own. But it also does mean that probably I'm not completely satisfied with structuralist agenda, or there were some new developments, let's say, in theory and science since then. And Kittler, which the later author I was mentioning, he's exactly one of the late post-structuralists who also was trying already to bypass, to overcome not only formalism, which he is not drawing that much on, but structuralism precisely. And in detail, I should mention that it was French structuring which he was trying to radicalize to German media theory. So all these steps are researched. All these steps we will discuss. And if you have bibliographical questions, just put it to the chat. I will try to be, at least I will ask Sakona to gather them, our moderator, and then I will provide you bibliography. Matvey.
Pavel, thank you so much for a wonderful first session. My question is kind of half answered by your response to Arnav, but I still find curious that, as you mentioned just now, that Kittler avoids drawing as much of attention to the question of formalism, which, if like just maybe perceived through this very I would say generalizing and rather reductionist lens, if I understand those parallel series but parallel developments, not necessarily in terms of different fields, but in terms of different localities of France, Germany, Russia, even France, we see this development with Balzac as of even within the Académie Française, we can see that this purism of language is kind of more rationalized by, oh no, we need to involve sciences with Buffon's presentation and so on and so forth. If in Germany that similar but different development can be justified, from what I understand, your point and Goethe's point is by this, reducing of this pathos of German language of Romanticism to the pure fact of like just bureaucratization, and whether we can see that similar, intention, similar movement in Russia, but kind of with in later time with formalist response to 9th century realism, or whether we cannot. That's like the question that probably like bothers me in this, because I don't think there were any like historical instances of that in the 19th century, kind of Russian intellectual life, that with formalism arises as this kind of reflection of, oh, we need to catch up in a way, right? In some way or another, with this more like factual approach. And whether you think it's similar to those or parallel to those particularly historical developments of localities, Russia, Germany, France. Yeah, sorry for.
Thank you for turning our discussion to like topographical terms and not only chronological, because I think it's important. In my own research, I'm very much excited exactly about the three national cultures. And as you maybe know, German departments very often united with Slavic departments, as in Princeton, for example, and many other places. And of course, historically speaking, Slavic tradition, well, Russian, but not only Slavic countries in general, were very much dependent on German model of knowledge in general, not only language or literary references, but for example, institutionally, Soviet and before that Russian university was also just a copy of German bureaucratic organization, right? It's very much different to French system. It's very much different to others. But this Allgemeine, this document, land law, which I was showing and quoting, it's actually something that defined my own education and maybe some of yours. Right, and this was important, but it was not necessarily linked to each other. So I presented you this in rather fragmented form, as Niam saw and called, though I was not mentioned in fragments. So formalism in first chapter, let's say in first presentation, was a key word for the intrigue of the course. So I was trying to explain why we will talk about techniques, technological history, which is of course linked to the some resonances with science as well for literature. Then we left this early 20th century aside after explaining how course itself organized, and started from the very beginning, at least from the very beginning of the positivist ambitions of literature. And we'll come at some interesting point, which again I refer to third seance, we'll come to the very interesting moment when we'll find formalism, which is at the same time software, let's say, of our course. We'll see its own historical context, its own context of historical moment, and which particular sciences, I may give you a spoiler, it will be linguistics and it will be psychophysiology, which particular science actually influenced this purist formalist understanding of literature and what they suppressed later. And this is super interesting, even for Saussure, even for linguistics. There are some empirical roots which will be suppressed. And both Literaturwissenschaft, like science of literature in formalist sense, in formalist case, and linguistics in Saussure's case, they will suppress the empirical basis of their science for becoming science, for becoming social, or let's say humanitarian science, like human science. But nevertheless, they have very precise hard science references linked to the moment when science started to measure speech or voice or light, or even like make some experiments on human body. And we will talk about them. There is very good also bibliography for that I will give you. But for today, material of German Romanticism, French physiologies, early physiologies, it has no yet precise connection to formalism. We're rather trying to look with formalist and later post-structuralist eyes on the very beginning of this story. But even if this story has some effects on Russian tradition, for example, from French and German, it's far away from formalism. So Belinsky was influenced by Hegel, we understand, right? But Belinsky is so far from formalism that I wouldn't risk to say in which football teams they are, like whether they're competing or not. We may say that formalists tried to erase their own national tradition by claiming to be first scientific literary theorists, right? And in this sense, all the previous literary criticism, and it's not only Belinsky, it's also Herzen, it's also Chernyshevsky, it's also Pisarev, and many, many, many others. All this, let's say, content-driven criticism was somehow left aside by formalists. They were pissed off, I'm sorry to say, with all this content-driven criticism, and they told, let's see on the letters what's happening like on the surface. And this was basic modernist claim. And let's not discuss politics anymore as all these strange people before. So this was a rupture, but then we'll see how it's finally was linked through the term of positivism. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Cleona, correct?
Yeah, Cleona.
I pronounce.
Yeah, sorry, it's Cleena. Cleena. Just I had a few quick questions. Well, there's some questions and observations. So I really liked that you talked about, well, I was kind of curious. You talked about Nietzsche as the last philosopher and first media theorist. I thought that was pretty interesting.
I was quoting Hitler, I should.
Were you? Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
It's his national rivalry with him.
And then another thing I thought which was interesting about Comte was that description was very like algorithmic. What he was doing, he had a set of rules, so it's quite system based. I thought that was kind of interesting in terms of thinking like about science. And then the other question I had is, with the Kittler reading, should we focus on the 1800 or the 1900? And also with Balzac, is there one text you think that really sings or is really important to read in his whole set?
Yeah. Thank you for, again, like bibliographical question. I would say that I precise the text which we'll read. So I couldn't point to any novel of Balzac because there are certain more, let's say, media sensitive, right?
Yeah.
For example, the novel where, for example, we see how typography works, how publishing house, and so on. It's amazing. I may also propose you the contemporary accronization of this book so that you see how much attention actually allocated to his own institutional and engineer environment of literature. So it could be a good hint for our course as well. Yeah. But for our early 19th century talks, which we more or less like exhaust today, we will read a preface to Human Comedy only.
Oh yeah, I did that.
It's mentioned on the course page, and it will be mentioned. So think, if you are interested, we may allocate it now directly to you, and it's not very big. It's a preface to this huge textual building which he will develop decades later. But in this preface, he explains his principle, and I quote him. You will find also Goethe in this. And it's at the same time for both traditions very much crucial. And these attempts of transfer of like epistemic transfers, let's call it, from science, from contemporary science, still not too far from literature, to literature as such, they happen parallelly in different countries, in three mentioned countries, national traditions, and sometimes there are also like interesting repercussions between them. So coming to Kittler, to second part of your bibliographical question, yes, there are two epochs, and you see that he's basically juxtapose what was happening around. He likes to call it circa 1900 and circa 1800. So for him, it's a parallel, but it's suspiciously like symmetric parallel of Goethe moment. He starts with Goethe, and I try to show how it could be applied to different texts. But you find excessive explanation why this particular passage was important not only for real poets and bureaucrats of 19th century, but for the whole construction, for the whole building of German model of knowledge on several levels, on poetic, on institutional. Yeah, so I again recommend to you or to someone else who will be interested maybe more in this German version to read at least preface or better Kittler's own chapters in the beginning. You will find easily on Faust.
Yeah.
And
No, I read.
then we
Yeah, I got to. I read the first one nearly.
So you prefer to take Balzac, right?
I think I'm more Hitler, to be honest.
Okay.
Because I kind of went to school in Germany as well when I was a child.
Cool.
So I
cool.
did the alphabet. So I
cool.
think there's a lot of interesting stuff to do with the alphabet.
Yeah, let's think about, like in last quarter of hour, think about practical things and decide who will take what. We may, if there wouldn't be competition, it will be easy. But if it would be, then we will divide. Because Kittler text is big. And if it's enough text, we may make it individually. What I wanted to add as a potential, like first I write down that I promised you this chronization to see. And second, we may see also how Goethe was quarreling with Newton about light, which is on its own very interesting text. So it's a huge and very wobbly actually corpus of his writings about light, but it's not deprived of some scientific sense. And for that, I may choose you the section in contemporary research literature, the book on objectivity, which is written by Laurent Deston and Peter Gallison, which are showing how Goethe was also drawing plants and what he meant under Urplant, like generalizing this, and what is morphology for Goethe. So if you're more interested not in literature but in scientific side of our German poet, I may also propose this, and let's decide how we exchange after the seminar will end. So yeah, film on Balzac text could be also a sort of a material for if you're more in visual culture, but it's based on literary text, so it could be also material for your presentation. You may cut certain screenshot, certain episodes from this film and explain how do you think materiality of letters, of printing press works for Balzac, what he wants to say to us. Yeah, so we'll add 2 points to today's bibliography for today's session: film on Balzac and the Goethe color theory. Okay, Rodolfo.
Hello, how are you? I was thinking about the influence also of of religion in the Russian formalism somehow. I mean, maybe Pavel Fiorensky made some few treats, essays, and written work about religion and visual culture in Orthodox religion that lately was part of the tradition of, if we can call it this way, of modern studies of fiction and literature in this way. So I was thinking about, or have you research on myths and religion and the separation between fiction and myth with the appearance of literature as an autonomous art or as an art, and how this has something to do, this scission between literature, science, and religion that has overcome, in your research?
Yeah, thank you for this question, which I need to define as a genre, the new genre question of terra incognita questions, let's say. So I will be sincere with you. I was never not only researching, but honestly interested in links between science and religion. This very link I found like metaphysics. And neither I was not excited about religion and literary connections, though they existed, but rather before formalists. So you see, if they try to condemn any impressionistic criticism, obviously they were not very fond of any kind of religion, and so they were much more radical than even like neutral atheist science or atheist literature. So they wanted to technologicize in a way, or make more scientific literary studies and literature itself. So, and then it will be contemporary to like Platonov, Lev, Tretyakov, and so on. The only link which I may here to propose here, and maybe again it could be one new type of like your presentation. So if I don't know something, then you are interested, so you should make a presentation about that. But the only link which could be here is actually through Jakobson, who, as you understand, was not Orthodox by his birth, but who was involved in some circles, rather in Prague already after immigration, with so-called Eurasianists. And it's not the Eurasianist which we have now. It was much more interesting, but still, so it was rather ideological movement, and it was not like religious, right? It was about some idea. It was linked to some aspiration that Eurasianism exists first, and that it has some ideological effects. And I couldn't like speculate on what Jakobson meant precisely, but there is some literature at least about that, and his links not to Florensky, maybe this was less clear, but to Bogotyrev and Trubetskoy, who was his colleagues in Prague circle, and also fond of different forms of Eurasianism. And they tried rather to find some variations in the words, in the roots, which I may call metaphysical, but still not religious even.
Yeah, but I think about, I mean, when you or when the researcher or when the formalist research folklore, religion or myth is inside the
not necessarily, because folklore could be absolutely paganist, right? I mean, if religious, you mean like Orthodox or monotheist?
No, I'm thinking. I mean,
in
I'm
wider
thinking,
sense.
Yeah, in a
all
wider
the
sense.
kinds of beliefs. Okay. Then it could be. But again, if you mean the prop morphology of fairy tale, and then it's I would say it's not precisely Russian formalism, which from my point is formalism. Yes, he's called formalist very often. Yes, he's Russian, and yes, he was in the same epoch. But this is some like very separately standing thing, which has some, again, intuition of formalizing, let's say, of narratology or like pre-narratology. But this is not the branch which I have in mind when I say Russian formalism. So I mean some clear group which was maybe doing the same as Probe, but Probe was never integrated in this circle. And he sometimes only appears in the overall publications on Russian formalists or some anthologies. And in some sense, he could be added here, but yeah. Okay, think about separate presentation on this. So maybe you don't need to choose the text from our bibliography, but tell us more about connection of formalism with religion through folklore. Cleona, you want to add more, or we give Carlo a chance first?
That's my old hand.
Okay, then Carla, and I see Peggy first appeared, then disappeared with hand. Yeah,
thank
so
you.
let's try to be short because we have 5 minutes and.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this very interesting lecture. And I have only a brief question for you. I wonder the role of Durkheim sociology in your theoretical framework. I mean, there is a short bibliography on the pivotal role that Durkheim has in the social sciences of the first half of 20th century and in the Russian sciences itself. And I think it is a very interesting idea of science in its influence on literature. What do you think about it?
Thank you for this question. I will share shortly the screen and show you that maybe you noticed on the screen.
Yeah.
So one of the chapters.
The tree culture, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In the book on which I'm working now on the this media infrastructure, but also scientific parallels of literature of beginning of the 20th century when Durkheim exactly was, well, end of 19th when he was working, has a title, Social Facts and Language as Such. And both of these linked to French sociology and linguistics, and both of them are linked to the notion of positivism. So Durkheim was talking about social facts after and referencing to Auguste Comte, and his same age, not compatriot because Saussure was Swiss, but working in Paris, was also talking about linguistic positivism, or rather Kittler was calling him semiotic positivism. Both of them were interested in Republican politics, meaning Dreyfus affair, and both of them were struggling for facts, not in scientific, but like in journalist sense, to be properly recorded and properly exposed. So you may say this story has a very direct connection to our interest because Saussure, not Durkheim himself, but Saussure indirectly will influence Russian formalists, and Russian formalists will try to do absolutely the same with literature, with literary science, what Saussure made to language. So they will try to make it scientific, immanent, and work on sort of literary positivism, if you want, or like positivist literary science, though it's like arguable whether we may risk to call them positivist, because themselves also struggling with the like hegemonical positivist thought of the epoch. But yeah, Durkheim will be only very much on our playlist, let's say, if not directly, then through references and so on. And if you're interested in this maybe more extensive talk about him, then I invite you to propose the topic with bibliography, please, not just Durkheim and me, but with bibliography and like precise angle which you want to discuss. We will try to make some talk about that.
Thank you very much.
And finally, Peggy, you should turn on your microphone.
I have dogs. I always have it off because they're always barking, but they're sleeping right now, so we'll be quiet and brief. I'm just finishing a grant in an archive on 19th century photography. So I think I would like to do the piece about Baudelaire. I have a lot of examples of how photography actually looked like. And I actually got to take pictures of the actual apparatuses that were used during that time period. So if that works for you, that would work for me. I mean, there's some things I should have taken images of that I didn't, that would work better for what we have. But
am I right that you want to make a paper, like presentation on photography of 19th century, on the how photography worked in sense of apparatus?
Yeah. And what they took pictures of. It's sort of fascinating because, you know, the original photography was not really had an aura to it still, but very quickly it became, you know, reproduction, and it combined with commercialization and travel, and it's just incredible. But, you know, the Brownie, the first popular camera that everybody could use themselves, was introduced in the 1900s, right on that cusp that you were talking about.
Yeah, we'll talk about photography on next lecture, and it will make sense if you will prepare your short presentations based on your own archival work for next lecture, which will be 25th of July. And we will talk exactly how Baudelaire was thinking about photography, was writing against this new invention, new media, new for him media, and which consequence he thought it will have for literature, for science, and for commerce. So we'll start to talk about it. We may integrate your presentation about photography next, as well as in one lecture later. But maybe it will, if it will have some visual material, it will be even better in the beginning.
It should have a lot of visual material, because that's all I've been doing is taking pictures and getting backaches. But they actually have the equipment, which is really interesting to actually have the apparatus. So I have some photos of the apparatus. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Cool. I'm very amazed with the next session. So let's keep in mind, and if Sakona is still with us, let's keep in touch through moderator of the course, okay? And please, I wrote down, but please double you, Peggy, about photography, Carla, about your game, rather in 2 lectures again. And who was it? And Rodolfa, if you will decide to make a paper about this. So pass all these ideas to Sakona so that she write down, and then I will distribute somehow. We didn't establish yet like the environment in which we will continue to communicate between. It's again to her, and I will accept any of your initiative in sense of media environment which you prefer. Also, all the bibliography, either through your own research on the website. You will find the page and like titles. Either again ask Sakona, I will pass the PDFs or what is allowed to pass. Very last question, Matvey.
Yeah, I can also hold on the question for next session. But if we have a second, just a quick clarification of terminology and its connection, which I particularly found, very important for how I guess proceed with my presentation, because I mentioned in the chat that I would like to give a presentation on Andrei Platonov, but it's particularly through the concept of techniques with reference to Gilbert Simondon's work, which I want to provoke a question of like, what is the relationship between your usage of the word technology and techniques, not to be very specific about it, but still as an open question for myself also to try to unpack. But if you can say a few words on that.
I will say a few words about that on the last lecture, okay? Because yes, I have some inspiration and even relation to introduction of Simondon into Russian language. But this is too big topic to be treated in not even in last minutes, but after them.
Totally.
Let's have a proper discussion of each interesting topics, and we'll meet in a week. And during this time, we'll communicate through Sakona, through our moderator, which particular texts we discuss, where take these texts from where, and how paper should look like. For the moment, I only recorded, that I will add 2 points to bibliography, and that maybe we'll have these pop-up presentations based on your own research, Peggy and others.
And Pavel, before we hang up, I have added my email in a chat for everybody. And I think the best way to organize this will be to create some kind of document that tracks what people are presenting on. So we'll definitely put that together and send that out to the entire class.
Okay. Thank you, Sakona. Thank you, everyone. See you next week, next Saturday.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Hi. I don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now, yeah. Hi. Sorry, I wasn't thinking about singing because of the schedule and but the change of calendar and the hours, I am able to be in most of the sessions. So I was thinking about singing in, and since Pavel said about doing a work on this, maybe I mean I'm thinking on staying.
Okay, that sounds good. Let me actually pause.